dance in the morning sun.
Well, I'm out to have a real good time, and now you wanna look at that girl standing over there.
I feel you touch me in the pouring rain.
She is so fine, I wanna make that girl mine.
Girl, you came to me on a summer breeze.
Don't be afraid of what you feel, lady. Now look at that girl, as sexy as can be.
And it's me you need to show. How deep is your love?
The girls are so fine. We can go on and on till the morning comes.
'Cause we're living in a world of fools, breaking us down.
Everyone remembers Jodeci, Boyz II Men, and Silk, but there's one 90s R&B group that had the same talent, the same hit potential, yet somehow they got left behind. Portrait, their debut single charted on the Billboard Hot 100. They had major label backing. They even performed on Family Matters, one of the most popular sitcoms of the 90s, and yet their success vanished almost overnight. So why didn't Portrait blow up the way they should have? It wasn't because they lacked talent. Something else held them back. And when you find out what happened, it's actually wild. Portrait wasn't just another R&B group lost in the shuffle. They had everything needed to become a household name. They debuted in 1992, a golden era for R&B when groups were dominating the charts. Their first single, Here We Go Again, wasn't just a minor hit. It peaked at number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on the R&B charts. That's the kind of chart position that puts groups on the map. They weren't a one-hit wonder either. Their second single, Honey Dip, became a top 20 R&B hit, proving they had momentum. They landed major soundtrack placements on blockbuster films like Addams Family Values and Blankman, a sign that the industry saw potential in them. And they even got a national TV moment on Family Matters, performing at the high school prom in season 4. At this point, everything looked like it was aligning for Portrait to be the next big thing in 90s R&B. Groups with less chart success and less exposure had gone on to have long, successful careers. So the question is, why didn't that happen for Portrait? Why didn't they make that leap from rising stars to R&B icons? That's where the industry politics come in. Here's the thing about the 90s R&B explosion. It wasn't just about talent. It was about branding. Record labels weren't just signing groups and letting the music speak for itself. They were handpicking their stars and crafting specific images to sell them to the masses. And in a decade where image was just as important as sound, Portrait didn't fit neatly into any box. Look at their competition. Jodeci, the bad boys of R&B, edgy, street-savvy, and sex-driven. They had Puffy and Uptown Records making sure they dominated. Boyz II Men, the clean-cut gentlemen, family-friendly, suited up, and primed for mainstream crossover success under Motown's careful grooming. Silk, the slow jam kings. They knew their lane, riding the wave of sensual R&B and locking down the grown and sexy crowd. But Portrait, their sound was polished and smooth, but it didn't lean fully in any direction. They weren't edgy like Jodeci. They weren't pop-friendly like Boyz II Men. They weren't strictly slow jams like Silk. Instead, they had elements of all three, blended with a jazzy, laid-back feel that made them different, but not different enough for the industry to latch onto. And here's where the real problem was. Labels pick winners, and Portrait wasn't one of them. If you were an R&B act in the 90s, your label's investment in you could make or break your career. And Portrait's label, Capitol Records, didn't give them the same push that Uptown gave Jodeci or that Motown gave Boyz II Men. Instead of seeing them as the next big R&B group, Capitol treated them like just another act on their roster, releasing their music, but not putting in the marketing dollars and radio promotion needed to make them household names. And in a decade dominated by music video culture, this was a death sentence. While Jodeci was getting high-budget Hype Williams-directed videos and Boyz II Men had major label sponsorship deals, Portrait was left to fend for themselves. No big budget, no high-profile marketing campaigns, no must-see music videos. And in an era where MTV, BET, and The Box were the ultimate tastemakers, that lack of visibility meant everything. So even though Portrait had the sound, had the vocals, and had the hits, they didn't have the machine behind them. And in the music industry, that's the difference between becoming legends or being forgotten. But here's what makes this story even wilder. If Portrait had come out just a few years later, they might have been huge. Because their sound, it wasn't just unique, it was actually ahead of its time, and that worked against them. Here's where things get really interesting. Portrait wasn't just different, they were actually ahead of their time. In the mid-90s, mainstream R&B was shifting toward commercialized, high-energy, and highly marketable sounds. Labels wanted crossover appeal. Jodeci was edgy, pushing the envelope with their streetwise image. Boyz II Men was safe, making love songs perfect for wedding receptions and pop radio. Silk leaned into the bedroom music that always had an audience. But Portrait, their music was smoother, jazzier, and more laid back, more in line with what we'd later call neo-soul than the R&B dominating the charts at the time. And the industry just wasn't ready for it. They sounded like the future, but the industry was stuck in the present. If Portrait had debuted just a few years later, their sound might have been embraced by the rise of neo-soul artists like D'Angelo, who blended jazz, funk, and R&B into a timeless sound. Musique Soulchild, who thrived with smooth, heartfelt tracks. Jill Scott and Erykah Badu, who made alternative R&B a major lane in the late 90s. Even Quincy Jones, one of the most respected producers in music history, admitted years later that Portrait was simply too early for their sound. That's music industry code for, we didn't know how to market you. If they had dropped in the late 90s or early 2000s, they likely would have been a major part of the neo-soul movement that exploded around that time. Instead, in the mid-90s, their style wasn't exactly what the industry was pushing, so they got pushed to the side. Visual montage, clips of neo-soul artists like D'Angelo and Musique Soulchild blowing up, followed by images of Portrait's music videos fading into obscurity. And that's when things really started to fall apart for them, because without a clear lane in the industry, their second album was doomed from the start. By the time Portrait's second album dropped in 1995, the industry had already started moving on. Their sophomore project, All That Matters, had potential. It had a polished sound and a few singles that could have gained traction. But there was one massive problem. Capitol Records barely promoted it. Their debut album had at least gotten some industry push, but by 1995, the label had shifted its focus to other artists. The lead single, I Can Call You, didn't make the same impact as Here We Go Again. The group even recorded a Bee Gees cover, How Deep Is Your Love, to appeal to a broader audience, but it barely got attention. And once that album failed to produce a major hit, Capitol dropped them. The harsh reality: the industry doesn't give second chances back in the 90s. If your second album flopped, that was pretty much the end. There was no streaming to give artists a second life, no social media to promote themselves independently. If the label wasn't pushing you, you disappeared. And that's exactly what happened to Portrait. By 1996, the group was essentially out of the mainstream conversation. No more radio play, no more music videos in rotation, no more label backing. But here's where things take a weird turn. Instead of trying to force a comeback in the US, Portrait turned to Japan. Japan loved them, but it wasn't enough. In 1996, Portrait released their third album, but only in Japan. Now, this wasn't uncommon. Japan had a massive love for R&B, and many US artists who struggled at home found success overseas. But the problem? It didn't translate back to the States. Their American fans barely knew the album existed. Without streaming, it was nearly impossible for US listeners to access their new music. And without a presence in the US industry, their relevance continued to fade. By the late 90s, Portrait was practically erased from the mainstream R&B scene. The 90s R&B boom left them behind. Here's the harsh reality. The late 90s was a brutal time for R&B groups. The boy band wave, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, 98 Degrees was taken over. Solo R&B stars, Usher, Brandy, Aaliyah, were becoming the main focus. The industry was shifting away from male R&B quartets unless they were superstars. And without a strong label, a defined brand, or major hits to sustain them, Portrait got left behind. For most 90s R&B groups, once the industry moves on, it's over. But Portrait, they actually tried to make a comeback twice. The 2005 return, a new lineup, but no buzz. After nearly a decade of silence, Portrait resurfaced in 2005 with a new album, Share My Love. But there was one big problem. It wasn't the same group anymore. Two original members, Eric Kirkland and Irving Washington III, were gone. They were replaced by two new singers, PJ DeMarks and Ruben R. C. Monge. The album was released independently, meaning no label push, no major promo, and no mainstream exposure. It didn't help that by 2005, R&B had completely changed. Neo-soul was the new wave, with artists like D'Angelo, Jill Scott, and India Arie dominating the grown folks R&B lane. The mainstream had shifted to hip-hop influenced R&B, with Usher, Beyoncé, and Chris Brown leading the charts. And record labels weren't investing in 90s R&B comebacks unless you were Boyz II Men or Jodeci level big. So, unsurprisingly, Portrait's comeback album barely made an impact. And after that, silence. Again, the 2018 comeback, a reunion that didn't take off fast, forward to 2018, and something unexpected happened. Portrait was back. This time, with most of the original members, they released a brand new single, In the Moment. They even tried to get all four original members back together, but Eric and Irving declined due to personal commitments. They announced plans for a new album, Afro Trees, a project focused on their classic R&B sound mixed with African influences. But despite all this, the industry didn't care. The song barely got any attention outside of their core fan base. There was no major label backing to push the music, and younger R&B fans? They had no idea who Portrait even was. Unlike groups like Jodeci, who had a built-in cult following, Portrait had faded so much that their comeback was met with little fanfare, even when they made an appearance on DJ Cassidy's Pass the Mic Volume 3 in 2020, performing Here We Go Again for a nostalgic audience. It wasn't enough to spark a true revival. At the end of the day, Portrait's legacy was never cemented like Boyz II Men or Jodeci. They didn't have a string of #1 hits to keep them in rotation. They weren't featured in major documentaries or BET specials about 90s R&B. And without that built-in nostalgia buzz, there was no demand for their return. Which means, even though Portrait is still making music today, the industry has long since moved on. So, after everything, the success, the industry neglect, the failed comebacks, does Portrait's story even matter anymore? Actually, yes, because their story isn't just about one group that got overlooked. It's about how the music industry chooses who succeeds and who disappears. The industry decides who gets remembered. Let's be real. Portrait wasn't less talented than Jodeci, Boyz II Men, or Silk. They had charting singles, major label backing, at first, TV appearances and movie soundtracks. But unlike the biggest 90s R&B groups, they didn't have a machine behind them long enough to cement their place in history. And this happens all the time in the music industry. For every Jodeci or Boyz II Men, there's a Portrait or Shay. Groups with talent but no long-term label investment to keep them in the conversation. Which begs the question, how many other artists have been erased simply because the industry stopped caring? Nostalgia can make or break a comeback. The difference between groups that make successful comebacks and those that don't? Nostalgia. Groups like New Edition, Boyz II Men, and Jodeci still tour because they never left the cultural conversation. Their music was replayed, sampled, and kept alive through media exposure. But Portrait, they weren't kept in rotation, so by the time they tried to return, no one was waiting for them. And without that built-in nostalgia factor, their return was doomed before it even started. Portrait deserves more credit than they got. At the end of the day, Portrait made an impact. They had hits. Their debut album was a success, and Here We Go Again is still an R&B classic. They paved the way. Their smooth, jazz-infused sound was a bridge between 90s R&B and what would later become neo-soul. They're still making music. Despite everything, they never stopped doing what they love. And maybe they never reached Jodeci or Boyz II Men levels of fame, but that doesn't mean their music didn't matter. It did. And it still does. So now that you know the real story of Portrait, what do you think? Did the industry do them dirty? Should they have been bigger than they were? Or were they just a group that didn't stand out enough? Let me know in the comments. And if you love 90s R&B, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because there are plenty more forgotten stories to uncover. Until tomorrow, stay tuned.